So it's really great to see that we've got, I think, 17 people we've traveled with before, and some people we've traveled with 4 or 5 times before. So we've got lifelong friends from our cruises. And us going to Iceland, for me and Susi, is particularly exciting because it'll all be fresh. We've got no preconceived ideas about it. And when we see something amazing, we will get that wow factor that you get when you haven't seen pictures about it or anything. And we're going to be learning a lot about a lot about Iceland and its history from our experts. The order of the talk, if you print off or you look at online at the order of the talks, they will change, but not the number of the talks. I will start off with talking about the voyage of the Brendan, which is about a 6th century monk who became a saint, who went in a canoe, in a large coracle, 30-foot coracle across the Atlantic to discover by mistake America, and then got back and was able to talk about it. And in 1976, a wonderful chap decided to redo this journey, and I was involved in the early part of the expedition, but I didn't actually go on it. And I went off down a river in Africa instead. So I'll talk about St. Brendan, and then we will get on to our experts' talks. And I feel that as a tour leader, particularly privileged and excited to be traveling with Irene and Declan. As John says, they're both academics and international lecturers in their field. Both are authors, and they've been involved in public engagement in their own subjects. So I think I'm going to let them introduce themselves and let them tell the story. So Irene and Declan, can you come in?
Are we sharing the screen already?
Yeah, I'll share it in a second. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the organizers of the session. It is lovely to see all of these people here. Very nice to meet you. I hope that I get to know you more, we get to know you more, perhaps in a cruise. And also say thanks for those lovely introductions. And as you said, we're both academics. Irene and Declan as well, have spent almost 2 decades now doing research on different topics that relate in one way or another to the Viking world. And I specialize a bit more on archaeological matters and law and the expanse of Vikings around the world. And I'd say you're more of a religion, literature, poetry kind of person, right?
I think that will become obvious.
Yeah,
today.
that will become obvious later today. And in the lecture for today, we have decided to show you just a little bit. So don't blame us if it's not too much, because there's a lot to tell, but just a little bit of that amazing time period, which is the Viking Age, in one of the epicenters of Viking expansion, which is Iceland. And we really wanted to talk to you about Iceland, obviously for 2 reasons. On the one hand, it's practical reasons. Some of you may be looking forward to joining the Iceland cruise that will take place in April this coming year, and where we will be speaking. So we thought maybe to start to get a sense of the history and the archaeology of that incredible place that is Iceland before your trip. On the other hand, if you're not going to Iceland, not a problem, because it's just an amazing place about which to listen things, to understand a little bit of the history of that country. It has a really, really unusual historical trajectory for Europe. And it developed in such interesting ways and so very late, because we had to take into account, as we will mention later, that the country had practically no inhabitants until the 9th century. So that is very odd for a country within the scope of our understanding of the Western world. So Iceland is a jewel for those of us that are specialists in the Middle Ages, and between the breathtaking valleys, the very lunar landscapes that you may become familiar with if you come to Iceland with us. There's 1,000 stories that are worth telling, but today we're not telling you 1,000 stories, we're only telling you 4. So we have chosen 4 objects from the National Museum of Iceland in Reykjavik. Is the most important archaeological collection in Iceland, and one that is really worth visiting. And we feel that they represent some aspects of the nation's Viking Age history, and they will only be brushstrokes, really, of a very complex and heavy loaded period, but they can give you a flavor of this amazing age in Iceland and really in the world at large. Hopefully, for those of you coming to the Iceland cruise, we'll delve into some of these topics in much more depth and detail later on in April. But first, I'm talking about Viking Age. Viking Age. Can you, Declan, tell us a little bit more about what is the Viking Age? I am going to share screen now.
I'm such a pest.
So if you can thumbs up if you see the screen. Yes, okay, fantastic. We're good then. Declan, so all of you.
Okay.
You can use the mouse for it.
Okay. Well, a lot of historians think of the time of the Vikings as running from 793 to 1066 AD. And that's especially true for English speakers, because that would mean the Viking Age begins with an attack on a monastery at Lindisfarne in the north of England in 793, and ends with the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York, which happened just before the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Even though a lot of the behaviors that we think of as being very Viking, they're actually happening long before 793. And some of them stop before 1066 or just keep going after that date. But even then, 793 to 1066 is a good approximation, because this is the period in which the people of Northern Europe, modern day Scandinavia, really, that's when they make their influence most felt. We often call them Vikings, and we'll use that word probably today quite a lot. Even though to these people, being a Viking was more like a job. So you go off for the summer to the east or to the south, do some Viking, and then come home to the farm, for example. So what did it mean to go Viking? Oops, there we go. Well, the Vikings are pretty famous for being an aggressive lot of people. And this map reasonably accurately shows some of the places where they raided for valuables or where they settled and formed new communities. And as you can see from the map, they explored pretty far. They got as far as Northern Africa, for example, and they actually made it as well to the American continent. I think it's fair to say that this group of people was not unique in their time for being aggressive. Really, they're just better at it than most of their peers. They were faster, they were more efficient, they're more pragmatic. And as my co-presenter has shown in her research, that pragmatism is really one of the defining features of a Viking. Where they couldn't raid, where they couldn't settle, they worked as mercenaries, or they traded, or they became involved in the communities in some other way. And of course, they were more than that as well, just as any group of people is. They were artists, and they were poets, and the people of Iceland, in particular, became known for their poetry. So much so that they basically had a monopoly on literature in the Viking Age. And so, that group is where the people of Iceland mostly came from. Although there are immigrants from other places as well, such as Ireland. And that's why an Icelander today might have a name like Cormac, or Cormac as it is in modern day Iceland, or Ireland, sorry. At the start of the Viking Age, in 793 though, Iceland wasn't settled, or at least it was barely settled. And I think that's where Irene Irene, sorry, takes over.
Thank you very much. He's calling me Irene because that's my name in Spain, but I've lived so long in the UK that I am Irene for myself. So you can refer to me as Irene, no problem. So talking about settlement, and that first early wave of settlement that turned Iceland from no man's land to a lot of people's land, the object that I have selected to start talking about the idea of settlement is this one, and you all see it. A good pair of mittens, right? So one would think, if you look closely at these mittens, that they must come from a time period that is closer to now. Maybe you would guess, okay, this is 1 or 2 centuries old, when the people of Iceland lived in wood, small houses dotted around the Icelandic countryside, and they made their own clothing, obviously, to fight the harsh Icelandic winters that we can testify they're quite harsh, and fight the winter with warm homespun wool. You can even see, if you go closely, the design in the fabric. There's this zigzag design of the fabric in the cuffs. And there's this clever string of wool that prevents something that all humans have clearly hated since time immemorial, which is to lose one glove, which happens to the best of us. But clearly someone was very clever here and prevented that from happening. So no matter how good these mittens look, they are no 19th century mittens. These mittens have recently been dated to the settlement period of Iceland, and that is more or less at the end of the 9th century to the first quarter of the 10th century. So these are very early. These are in fact some of the earliest mittens to have ever been used in the land of Iceland, and they were in fact worn by a child. So these are children's mittens. So why are these mittens of interest to us? Well, first of all, because they look so pretty and they're in such good conditions. It's very rare to find archaeological items in such conditions, especially if they're textile. But for such a simple object, it tells us many things about this early Iceland, about those first decades of settlement, when humans and animals from other geographical locations, mostly Norway, Scotland, Ireland, moved to what we know as Iceland today. And they were moving, looking for land, looking for status, sometimes looking for safety because they were running away from troublesome times elsewhere. And very importantly, they were looking for and achieving with the move the growth of family power. This move to Iceland sometimes is represented in, for instance, romantic paintings, as the one that you're seeing in screen, that is a 19th century painting. It's represented as a heroic enterprise of men, warriors. In this case, warriors with very wrong helmets, because never wings or horns in a Viking helmet. But this is not an actual representation of what the move to Iceland would have been like. I think this gloves is a better representation because it was something far more familiar, and it was something far more related to everyday needs, the getting of land for the farm, the surviving in new conditions. So in the 11th century, to help me paint the picture of this settlement, lived a priest. And in that 11th century Iceland, we had this priest called Ari the Wise. He became known as Ari the Wise because he was the first to compile Icelandic history in the same way that other European medieval chroniclers were doing. So it may seem surprising, but during the Ari the Wise lifetime, and really during the next couple of centuries, the 12th, the 13th century, Iceland was not some isolated, desolate land that no one knew about. Even though it had only been settled for such a short time, Iceland became one of the most amazing centers of cultural production in all of Europe during the Middle Ages. The sagas of the Icelanders, maybe you have heard about them, maybe even you have read them, they are testament to the cultural boom. So Ari the Wise, who was this pioneer historiographer, tells us a lot about that early Iceland. He tells us that Iceland was first settled in the year 874. And from this year, it was a very steady and quick process. Ari states that the whole initial big settlement was finalized in just 60 years. And that big initial enterprise was begun by a sizable amount of people that formed the early settlement parties, around 415 people. So we can imagine a country where there's no one, to all of a sudden around 415 people starting to settle and settling in what we can recognize as the main settlement areas of Iceland today. So when these early settlers showed up in Iceland, there was no native pre-existing population, as was the case everywhere where the Vikings settled, everywhere else, like for instance, Greenland. But the island wasn't quite empty. There were some Irish monks called Papa, who may have lived in communities or in isolation as hermits before 874. But apart from this one monk here, little community here of Irish monks, there was no one. There is a medieval text called Landnámabók, or translated, the Book of Settlement, that tells us very interesting stories of this early phase of the country, very often combining actual events with a little bit of narrative flair. But in general, we can see from this text how people from different origins and different religions came to Iceland at the same time. For instance, there's the story of a chieftain called Thorolf and his crew. Thorolf was a great believer in the god Thor, about whom Declan's going to talk to us in a little bit. So he was a believer in the god Thor, and to decide where should he settle, he threw part of his important furniture, a wooden high seat that would eventually make the center of the hall that he would build for himself. He threw this overboard in the ship, and he asked Thor for guidance. He said, Thor, where should I settle? So then the wood just floated on the water and landed at a certain place, and that's where they settled. And that place is still today called Thor's Ness, which means the headland of Thor. So this is something that happens a lot in Iceland, where you can see that the very old stories and the very old history still has a place in today, and you can find it in the place names and in other situations. Another story that shows how these early settlers were also Christian, or actually mixed religions. They were followers of the Old Norse religion and they were followers of Christianity. Sometimes they mixed them together. Happens in that same context of the early texts composed in medieval Iceland. In one of the stories, we know of one father and one son that travel together in the same boat. They are part of the same crew. The father believes in Christ, but when he's traveling, he rather worships Thor because he's so much better with the weather than his perception of Christ. So all the time Christ, but when there's a storm, I'm so sorry, it's Thor time. So he is in this voyage, there's a storm, the man starts, worshiping Thor, and the son complains because the son is a Christian and he believes it's silly to have this mix of religions. So just this story tells us that even in the same families, when they move to Iceland, we have people with completely different beliefs and sometimes beliefs that work together. So these settler parties, usually under the charge of a powerful chieftain that at the very least was wealthy enough to have a fleet of ships, or some ships at least, they travel with cattle, with sheep, with horses. The very famous Icelandic horses are the descendants of horses that traveled from elsewhere, Ireland, Norway, into Iceland. They travel with goats, with pigs, but they also travel with their extended family, which including children, like the ones that own these pairs of mittens that we're looking at. So there's no warriors crossing the sea heroically, but practical men and women who saw an opportunity to have more than they had back where they were coming from. And while these settlers came from cold lands, most of them came from Norway, Iceland, Scotland. I mean, they were not coming from Spain. Some of them may have, but they were not from sunny, hot places. It is the sight of a glacier that prompts one of the settlers to call the island Iceland. We can truly certify that it is an icy place. And even in the Viking Age, when Iceland was warmer than it is today, because it was warmer. These mittens are an example of the everyday necessities to combat the weather of these early settlers of Iceland. And now, Declan, do you want to continue?
Thank you very much. I'll just get in position. So I'm going to show you now a bronze figurine, which will be the focus for the next section of this talk. This figurine is supposedly from around the year 1000, so about half a century after the end of that settlement era, although it's actually very difficult to date. It was found on a farm near Akureyri in the north of Iceland, which is a fairly spectacular area of the country, worth visiting. And some people think it might be a representation of Thor, an Old Norse god that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And this really is one of the most important objects that has survived to tell us about early religion in Iceland as well as in Scandinavia. It tells us about the gods that the people worshipped there. So, as you might expect, it's a huge and impressive piece of work. It's so big that I'm not actually sure if you can make it out on the slide next to the silhouette that I provided for scale. It's a whole 6.7 centimeters tall. And it's actually so small that the first time I went looking for it in the National Museum in Reykjavik, I walked right past it at the entrance. And I spent the next 2 hours searching the museum for it. But all the same, it's a very impressive figure. It's very well made, considering how small it is. And it's a really interesting object that packs a lot of information into a very small space and prompts a few intriguing questions as well. Firstly, we can't be sure that this actually is Thor. It probably is Thor, but nowhere on the figurine does the name Thor appear. And nowhere in any of the texts of Old Norse religion that survive is this figurine referenced. So really the identification is guesswork. And that shows how little we know about Old Norse religion. Modern historians are always reconstructing, we're always guessing, because most of the stories and the rituals of Old Norse religion, they've been forgotten or purposefully erased by later Christians who naturally thought of it as heresy. So this might be a different god, because Thor was only one god among many. As you can see from this complicated family tree here. Depending on how much you know about Old Norse religion and Marvel movies, you might have heard of some of those other gods. You might have heard of Odin, his father, and the head of the gods, according to some myths. You might have heard of Frigg, his stepmother, Loki, his friend, and the betrayer of the gods, maybe Freyr and Freya, two very significant gods from another family. But the figurine is most likely, oops, can I go back?
Yes, right. There you go.
Weird. To be Thor, because he's actually the most important god amongst the Icelanders in this period. He was probably the head god for most Icelanders rather than Odin, although Odin might have been important to, for example, poets. Many of those who came to Iceland seem to have come worshipping Thor, just like Irene's chieftain Thorolf. Many of them are called names like Thorolf, or Thorstein, or Thorbjorn, or Thorbrand, far more than anyone was named after a god like Freyr or Odin. Many more places in Iceland seem to have been called after Thor than any other god as well, whether in Thor's honor or because someone thought this place was special to their god. And Thor might have had many functions. People nowadays normally associate him with thunder and lightning, but by the time he was in Iceland, which is a place without much thunder and lightning, that function was probably, if not gone, then very diminished. Why would you have a thunder god if there's no thunder? But Thor still might have been associated with other types of weather, such as control over the wind, which would have been important for those settlers and for later fisher folk as well. He was definitely important as a protector of humans and other gods. And to be honest, I think that the Icelanders would have seen Thor fulfilling most of their religious needs. even if other gods had those jobs back in Scandinavia. In Iceland, they might even have associated Thor with the rumbling, exploding, unpredictable earth that they had around them. So if a volcano goes off again near Reykjavik when the cruise is happening, we know who to blame. At the same time, even if this is Thor, it's a very unusual little figurine. If you look closer, we can see that he has this unusual hammer-like object in his lap. Now, this might be Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and it might even refer to a famous myth of Thor, in which Thor dresses up as a woman to sneak into giant lands after his hammer has been stolen. And if so, this holding the hammer in his lap might be kind of an unfortunate innuendo that survived from the Viking Age. But at the same time, the hammer seems to be blended into the beard, and it has this unusual dual shaft system. And I don't think we can say why. Again, we can guess. There's one scholar who thinks that it refers to weather magic and shows Thor breathing into his beard and the hammer to make the wind. This might just be an unusual part of a gaming piece. It might be an upside-down Christian cross we're looking at. Maybe the figure some weird combination of these features. Because again, if this piece shows us anything, it's that it's very difficult to find evidence for Old Norse religion and then to interpret it. Because the Old Norse religion was not uniform. It could change. Thor could be the head god in one place and Odin in another. Some early Icelanders were apparently essentially atheists who refused to sacrifice to any god at all. As Irene has mentioned, some settlers might have worshipped both Christian and pagan gods. And we can back this up through archaeology as well. Through this piece, this mold from Denmark, which is able to cast both Christian crosses and pendants in the shape of Thor's hammer. So somebody was making both hammers and Christian crosses at the same time in Denmark. Christianity might have come with the early settlers, but it seems to have actually decreased in popularity over the first century in Iceland. But that doesn't mean that the two religions didn't coexist or even merge. If you believe in a pantheon of gods, why not add Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and a few saints to Thor and Odin and Freya and Frigg? And as Irene will soon tell you, Christianity did eventually win out for political as well as religious reasons, as Icelanders sought to quell conflict among themselves and to resist pressure from outside influences. This happened essentially by decree of the Icelandic Parliament around the year 1000, around the time this figurine was actually supposed to have been made. Pagans were supposed to be allowed to practice in secret for a little while longer after the year 1000. But I personally wonder if that was designed to make the Old Norse religion seem shameful. Anything illegal was seen as shameful in this period when it was done in secret, instead of being committed out in the open. So murder was bad, but murder's a lot worse for somebody in medieval Iceland if you don't tell someone about it. But still, there's evidence that big rituals to gods like Thor did continue in Iceland for about another century, until maybe around the year 1100. And of course, the memory of elements of religion still survive in Icelandic folklore today, as well as in books, art, on TV screens, and in lots of modern culture, really.
And now we're going to travel to Iceland. We're going to travel all the way to probably my favorite place in Iceland. So I'm taking you there today. And one that if you do travel to Iceland with us or later on by yourselves, you will certainly visit and it will take your breath away. But let us introduce this place and its history with my last choice of objects. You can see it on the screen. Can anyone guess what this would be?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks like it could be a pendant, but it is not. There's a piece of wood, as you can see on the bottom, that it's still attached to it, even if it's broken. So this thing is clearly going on top of a long shaft of wood. This is what's called a crozier, okay? It's in fact an object closely connected with the narratives of religion that Declan was just talking about. It's a crozier or a bishop's staff, okay? So this is the top of a bishop's staff, and in this case, it's the top ornamental part. So we have a bishop staff here, and this type of bishop staff is mainly known, weirdly, in the Eastern Roman Church. So what is it doing in Iceland? The reason is because while it's very common in the Eastern Roman Church, it has also been preserved in Ireland. And we know that the connection between Ireland and in general the Viking world, and here concretely with Iceland, is very, very close. So we have found this kind of shape carved in relief stones from the first half of the Middle Ages in Ireland. So we know it must have come from there. But the object is decorated with a Scandinavian type of decoration, which is called the urned style. It's a type of animal heads that are carved into the metal, and that style, called urned style, and this type of crozier, that combination, this is the only object in the world that we know of with this combination. So it's quite unique. Some scholars propose that it must have belonged to one of the first bishops of Iceland, and that it is dated to the end of the 11th century. So something like 1075 to the end of the 11th century. So why would we think this would belong to one of the first bishops of Iceland and not just to a traveling bishop from somewhere else? Or, it had been an imported good. Well, the location in which this was found is possibly the most notable location in terms of law and religion in all of Iceland. And now this is my favorite location. It's called Thingvellir in Icelandic, okay? So this is this outstanding, very, very large area where you can see that in the deep hollows of the rift produced by the continental drifts between the Eurasian and North American plates, there we find Iceland's greatest assembly site from the Viking Age, the assembly called the Alþingi. Still today, that is the name of the National Parliament of Iceland. So the name of the early parliament, the early assembly, the Alþingi, is still today the name of parliament downtown Reykjavik. So Vikings must have chosen this visually liminal place, very impressive place, as a location where people from all of Iceland would travel to once a year to meet, discuss legal matters, reach agreements, make business, punish criminals, debate their cases in legal assembly. It was a sort of parliament mixed with like Supreme Court, like court and parliament together. But these, like many other assembly sites, was also a place where markets would happen. So when everybody was gathering for assembly, the right time of the year to bring in markets, to do social activities, where, you may meet someone to marry next year, who knows? And it was also a place where religious events would take place. So there's this location where there's this mix of society, law, religion, everything. So it becomes a central focal point for Viking Age Iceland. In the year 930, this place became the first national assembly, and thus the Alþingi claims to be one of the oldest still functioning parliaments in the world. This was an assembly that was serving a very large amount of people. So let's say that by this time in the 10th century, in 930, we can calculate approximately that Iceland's population would have been in between 10 and 20,000 people. So imagine how much it had grown from those first 415 settlers at the end of the 9th century. And then you find yourself in the 10th century and you have from 10 to 20,000 people. So what an explosion. That's a real explosion of population. So in the Alþingi meetings during the Viking Age, there was one elected law speaker that would hold his office for 3 years, and that person would stand atop a law rock. In the place that we are looking at, there's one place called Law Rock. We don't know exactly where it's located. We think maybe around where the flag is, but we really can't tell. But he would stand up atop this rock and recite the law in front of all of attendees, all of the law. Since we are talking about an oral society, they can write, but they're keeping memory orally. So everything must be recited in front of the others to hold legal value. So the location where we find our crozier or bishop staff is so significant in Iceland's history, and it was really the focal point for the exercise of legal power at the time where this bishop staff was made, before and after. In fact, even though this was unofficially, this keeps being used until the late 18th century or very early 19th century. Such is the implications and the significance of this place that it actually plays a huge role in the religious unification of Iceland. As Declan was talking about a second ago, and I have mentioned as well, religion was varied and independent on the individual. It was idiosyncratic. It was mixed at times. But in the year 1000, something happened, and something happened in Thingvellir that changed all of that. For a while, tensions between Christians and those who professed Norse religious beliefs were getting a bit higher. Families were entering disputes, individual people were attacking each other physically or legally, and it was decided in Thingvellir that Iceland should choose one religion and to thus end all disputes and secure the smooth running of all of the country. So do you remember before I was talking about our dear Ari the Wise, that was this medieval historiographer that we owe a lot of, our knowledge to? So he tells us his version of this event, of this religious change, which is a little bit fantastic, mind me, but it may contain some pearls of truth. He tells us this. Imagine the Althingi, the assembly, is happening in Thingvellir. People are gathering all around the Law Rock, having a strong disagreement. Actually, they're almost fighting. They're almost killing each other. Christians and non-Christians don't feel that the law of Iceland applies to both of them. So there's a conundrum presented to the law speaker, what to do. Christians are upset, non-Christians are upset, no one feels represented. So as it was normally in assembly meetings, which could last for several days, people have booths and tents where they would spend the night. So the law speaker goes to his booth, he covers himself with his cloak and does not come out for 24 hours. So he's silent, does not talk, does not move from under his cloak for a whole day. Everybody's wondering what's happening. And when he comes out, Ari the Wise tells us that he gathers everyone at the Law Rock and speaks. And he tells them how dangerous it is to strive over religion like this, because there's the potential of war and the destruction of the free state that they had built so quickly and so efficiently in Iceland. So he has a resolution and he says, let us all have the same law and the same religion. It will prove true that if we tear apart the law, we will tear apart the peace. So people agreed, and he exclaimed, let all the people be Christian, and those in this country who had not yet been baptized should receive baptism. But he also added, as Declan was talking about before, that people could keep sacrificing and practicing their beliefs and worship according to their own religion at home, but in secret. If you are caught, there will be punishment. So this change happened in the year 1000. And the bishop staff that we're looking at, before, thank you very much, is just more or less 100 years after that conversion into inverted commas of transition into formalized Christianity of Iceland. So the fact that we have bishop-related objects in such a central legal place gives us hints about the development of the Althingi, the development of Christianity, in the 11th and 12th century in Iceland. It's telling us that something's happening, a change is happening, but there's this acceleration of Christianity as a central religion. For a while after this official decision in the assembly, it was priests, wandering bishops, or traveling bishops that fought to have some power in this new Christian land. But towards the end of the 11th century, where we have our crozier, bishops were developing a more centralized power in Iceland. And there is nothing more central, as we have said, than Thingvellir. So I hope you get to see it quite soon. And now, Declan, if you want to continue.
Let's get center again. So, yes, I would like to discuss the end of that parliament's independence and the country's takeover by a Norwegian king in the 13th century. And to do that, I'm going to look at an unusual object. This is a door. This is actually the door of the church, coming from Valfjolstaðir in the east of Iceland, which is believed to have been carved around 1200, which was in the middle of a period of intense civil strife across Iceland. There's little of the sign of this strife on the object. It's quite a romantic image that it holds, and it's been beautifully carved. But a closer look reveals a lot about the push and pull of politics and cultural loyalties in Iceland in this period. It shows the Viking Age past meeting a more European future. Now, the door has two main sections that survive. The bottom is the simpler one, so let's start there. As you can see, it's a very nice image of some dragons. But it's interesting to note that dragons, much like these ones, appeared on pagan art all over the north and were taken up by Christianity as well, when Christian monuments began to be crafted. So this pagan past could be molded to fit a Christian present. And it had already been, at this point, for hundreds of years. They've been taking that past and remolding it for their own Christian use. Of course, it must have helped that dragons were not exclusive to Old Norse myths. Because on the top image of this door, we find the story of a king who seems to be killing a dragon to save a lion. The lion actually then seems to become his friend and even seems to mourn the king when he eventually passes away. Now, this kind of story of a king and his lion, it seems like it's a variation on a tale by a French poet, Chrétien de Troyes. Until this period, as far as we know, Icelanders didn't have this kind of chivalric romantic story. They didn't even have knights. They tended to fight on foot rather than on horseback, and they didn't have cavalry units or anything like that in their warfare. But in the 13th century, there's a big shift in literary tastes. And these kinds of romances of knights start becoming really popular in Iceland as a form of saga. They are imported from Europe, but they get twisted to fit traditional Icelandic ways of storytelling. And Icelanders even invent a few native chivalric stories of their own. Probably, these stories were imported through the Norwegian court of King Haakon IV, whose name is worth remembering today, because it's a very important name in the history of Iceland. And this change in literary tastes is just one, actually quite minor, example of how Haakon influenced Iceland. For a long time, Iceland had been an island apart, literally and metaphorically. There's been a little danger of invasion to Iceland just because of how far away it is from the rest of Europe and how dangerous its waters are. It didn't have much in the way of natural resources. Its main exports were fish and textiles, although sulfur mines do become important in the next few centuries, and that's pivotal in warring Europe for the production of gunpowder. But despite Iceland's problems from the point of view of invasion, Norwegian kings had been showing an interest in Iceland over the centuries of the Viking Age. And in fairness, Icelanders showed a lot of interest in Norway too. Some of them traveled to Norway and worked for the king as both fighters and poets, essentially as retainers. And so, at once, Icelanders seem to have respected and even been awed by Norway's royalty, at the same time as being wary of it and what it meant for their island. So there's a kind of equilibrium that lasts for centuries, but it doesn't last forever. And really that's because both sides of that equilibrium, that equation, they get upset around the time of the carving of the door. On the one hand, Hákon IV, that Europeanizing king, he's unusually keen on Iceland, and he's powerful and patient enough to satisfy that interest. Norway had actually considered invading Iceland in 1220 in response to a trade dispute. But in the end, Hákon didn't need to invade, because Iceland itself was becoming a place of increasing conflict by the 13th century. Power becomes increasingly centralized over the 1100s, with really 5 or 6 families holding all of the power, as lesser chieftains swear allegiance to them. So the door actually comes from a church associated with one of those families, who at one stage controlled most of eastern Iceland, and some of that family die in the conflict that's happening in this period. I think the intricacy of the carvings on the door, that reflects the wealth that the family managed to accrue in this period. And it was probably partly designed to show that wealth and to reflect the family's authority. And so these 6 families, 5 or 6 families, they fought amongst themselves, sometimes violently. There were some quite large battles. They often ignored or manipulated and undermined that all-important legal and political system that had been working so well in Iceland for centuries. And partly, I think, maybe this is my point of view as somebody interested in religion, but partly their ability to do this to the legal system might be a result of the conversion to Christianity. Before the conversion, a chieftain might have had religious duties related to the temples that existed for Old Norse gods. But these responsibilities probably weren't replaced with Christianity. So maybe a chieftain's power could be more easily traded or given away, even to somebody who was already a chieftain after the conversion to Christianity. Similarly, secular rulers might also have accumulated power through their association with the church, and many of them controlled church estates. And just the presence of the Christian church might have made the complicated the Icelandic parliament and stopped them from making necessary updates to the legal system. Probably updates that these powerful chieftains didn't want to be made anyway, as they would have interfered with their centralizing, unifying all the power. So, when Hákon actually gives power and land in Norway to some of these warring Icelandic chieftains, that obviously puts the chieftains in a compromising position. And it should be no surprise that Hákon takes advantage of that compromising position. And he insists that his Icelandic retainers help him take over Iceland. And in fact, by the middle of the 13th century, Hákon seems to essentially have, to some extent, been choosing who the chieftains would be in Iceland. Still, it did take a long time for Hákon to fully make his power felt in Iceland. Even though he begins taking an interest in the 1220s, it's not until 1262 that the Icelanders accept him as king, and they sign a covenant at the Althing with an oath sworn on a Bible. Possibly this covenant is still preserved today in later manuscripts like the one you can see on the screen, hopefully. So this door, for me, I think it's a remarkable document. It reflects the great power of some Icelanders over others, but it also reflects the increasing influence of Norway in Iceland. It looks back towards some of the older traditions of Iceland as well, even to the religious and legal cultures established in the Viking Age. It was owned and created by people involved in a battle for the future of their island, a strife that they had partly caused themselves by their own want for power, but also by the involvement of the church that this door was attached to, as well as the outside royal power that the door celebrates. To my romantic mind, maybe then, the period in which this door was made and used, rather than 1066, maybe then we can call this the true end of the Viking Age on the island of Iceland. Thank you very much.
Thank you.